Hi, I'm Ashley Ford, and this is 112BK. Coming up, hauntings. Is it the ghosts that define a spirit-rich space, or the people trying to reconcile the feeling that they're among ghosts? An author gives us his take.
Her family was cursed by anyone who'd ever been killed by a Winchester rifle, and that the only way to keep them at bay would be to build a house that was never finished. And so she had workers working on the house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the entirety of her life.
And then an advocate for subway reform who drank Andrew Cuomo's tears. We're assuming they were crocodile tears.
You have to have people on the inside. I can't disclose my sources for obtaining his tears, but I will tell you that they're very bitter.
Just ahead, the newly crowned Miss Subways will talk about the city's broken down transit system and how they're using their new designation to advocate for reform. But first, when we talk about hauntings, it's usually the ghosts who get top billing. But it's the humans occupying so-called haunted spaces who really leave a mark. From garlic necklaces and silver bullets to elaborate costumes and even architectural design, humans have developed all sorts of tactics for dealing with the undead. How we of the flesh react when confronted by spirits says a lot about who we are as a society. And that's the focus of a recent book by our next guest. It's called Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places. And we're happy it brings the author Colin Dickey to the show as we celebrate Halloween. Thanks for joining us, Colin.
Thanks for having me on.
So, first of all, can you describe your fascination with ghosts and hauntings?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a pretty standard suburban house, looked like every other one on the block, but I grew up in San Jose, California, near the Winchester Mystery House, which is often referred to as the most haunted house in the country, although whatever that means. But,
right.
you know, it's this, the Sarah Winchester was the daughter-in-law of the guy who invented the Winchester rifle. And after her infant daughter and then subsequently her husband died, she moved out to San Jose, bought an 8-room farmhouse, and spent the rest of her life enlarging it and left behind a 161-room Victorian mansion that is set up very much like a labyrinth. And this is the house that I used to spend a lot of time at as a kid, and I just fell in love with this idea of a house that could be sort of endless and strange and uncanny and confusing. And that's, you know, from a young age, I kind of planted a seed in my mind as to, you know, why do some houses seem more haunted than others? Why do some houses make us feel sort of unsafe and uncomfortable in? And I think that kind of drove the impetus to this book.
Why'd she build all those rooms?
So when you take the tour, one of the things that you're told is that she visited a psychic who told her that her family was cursed by anyone who'd ever been killed by a Winchester rifle, and that the only way to keep them at bay would be to build a house that was never finished. And so she had workers working on the house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the entirety of her life. And she would get directions from ghosts through midnight seances as to where to build next. When I actually started doing the research and actually digging into the historical archive, I found a lot of that story turns out to not be entirely accurate. And so that just sort of drove me on further, because then my question became, you know, if this story is not true, why is it so fascinating to people? Why does it keep getting retold? And what is embedded in that story? And that, you know, ended up driving the book, is sort of trying to understand not only why are some buildings seen as more haunted than others, but why do some stories kind of catch with our imagination in a way that others don't. Another thing that really drove this book was the first time my wife and I tried to buy a house, and we started looking at houses. And, you know, if you've been through that process or know anybody has, you know, a lot of it is just going to house after house after house after house. And some of them just feel very strange, you know, particularly the houses that have been sitting on the market for a long time often have been sitting on the market for a long time for a reason. And I started to sort of really pay attention to how I felt when I was in these houses, and why some houses sort of made me just feel a little nervous. There were houses that my wife and I just sort of instantly knew we didn't want to be in, even though on paper it looked fine. And so I think those, you know, in some cases, those stories that we tell about, you know, the boogeyman and and the ghost and all that stuff have, as you say, sort of a lot to do with how we're feeling about a place and why why some hotels, particularly like a nice old hotel, is just sort of odd. Like maybe one time it was very luxurious, but now to stay in it, you kind of can't wait to check out in the morning. And, you're sort of afraid to maybe sort of close your eyes. And I think I was really sort of attuned to why those spaces sort of created that feeling, and whether or not that feeling in some case precipitated this need for stories about ghosts or goblins or demons or whatever.
So why did you decide to tell this story specifically? Like, what did you really want the reader to walk away knowing or having learned?
Well, as I said, in some sense, it started with Sarah Winchester and the Winchester Mystery House, and my discovery that story that I had always grown up with was not historically accurate. And I as a historian and researcher, of course, I got really interested in, what is the true story and how does the legend diverge from the true story? And then I started to think, well, why this story? And, with Sarah Winchester's case, it's a story about a woman living alone, which, in our somewhat sort of sexist culture, we tend to look askance on, women who do not remarry, who do not have kids, et cetera, et cetera. It's a story about guns, which in our culture is a flashpoint. And specifically, our relationship to firearms has changed so dramatically, from when, Sarah Winchester's father-in-law was glutting the market with these machine-made rifles versus now. And so I started to think about, the way in which that story of Sarah Winchester became a way for us to maybe sort of work through some of our anxieties about women, about the wealthy, about firearms, about all these things. And then I started to look kind of more generally at stories throughout the country. And, because I did find that ghost stories, there are some universals, but they're always very culturally specific. And so I decided to really sort of look at American hauntings as a way of understanding, are these ghost stories sort of saying something about how, we Americans, however you want to define the we in that sentence, what are they expressing about, our anxieties or our desires or our fears or that kind of thing. So
you also go a little bit into the intersection of race and hauntedness. So I'd love it if you talk a little bit about that, because, while Black Americans have historically endured the brunt of horrific acts in America specifically, it's largely white Americans who live on as ghosts in these stories. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, and so, right. So before I get to Black Americans, maybe it's helpful, again, to think about American hauntings and the we. One of the things, the sort of common cliche you get is the haunted Native American burial ground, right? The perfect suburban house that turns out to be haunted, and there was an Indian burial ground there, and that's a sort of common horror trope. And again, there's a very sort of obvious but unacknowledged, for me anyways, sort of anxiety, particularly that white Americans have about who actually owns this land that I just paid for. And so the haunted Indian burial ground becomes a way of kind of working through that trauma without actually acknowledging any guilt or actually having to deal with it. So they become this kind of double-edged strategy, I think, for sort of dealing with America's sort of traumatic past without actually having to own it in any sort of material way. And I think that also carries through with a lot of the way these ghost stories sort of work through issues of sort of blackness and whiteness and slavery. And so, I went to Richmond, Virginia in particular because I had heard, well, this place is really haunted and it's just one of the most haunted downtowns in the country. And I thought, okay, that's great. And I found stories of, haunted brothels and haunted bars and I quickly just sort of started noticing that all the stories I found were about white ghosts, and I thought, for, just a basic understanding of Richmond as, the second most, I don't know the exact word, busiest slave trading market in the South, thought, why is this place that is so thoroughly haunted, why aren't we telling stories about the actual horror and trauma of slavery? And so again, there are these ways to sort of approach the trauma of America's past, but sometimes kind of draw back in these crucial ways. And I think that kind of push and pull is really important for understanding, I think, generally how Americans face race and how white Americans face race. As we want to talk about it, but not in a way that requires anything from us, you know. And so when I would find stories about ghost stories about slavery, it was often about slave owners. You know, it would be sort of horrific. You know, some guy who was a horrific, violent mistreater of slaves and did terrible things, but he was the ghost, not his victims. You know, so there was always that sort of weird erasure and sort of focusing on both bad and good white people, but only white people, and that kind of drove that part of that book. So.
Would you say that the ghost stories that we hear in America have regional flavors? You know, because one of the things as soon as I started reading certain parts of the text, one of the things that came to my mind immediately was learning about haints.
Yeah.
You know, but haints seem to be in specific places, and there were places where they had never, what's a haint? Like, what does that even mean?
Right. I mean, yeah, it's definitely regional, and that's again, I mean, why I tried to find a way to organize the book that was both sort of vaguely chronological. It starts with the Salem witch trials, and it ends with technological ghosts, but also sort of regional in the sense that I was really trying to pay attention to how in the Northeast, unsurprisingly, you find a lot of ghost stories about Puritan culture, about the Revolutionary War. Whereas in Hollywood, you're going to find ghost stories about the 30s and Rudolph Valentino and Marilyn Monroe and the Black Dahlia and things like that. And so there is definitely a regional aspect which I see as the sort of specificity of how ghost stories do specific work for specific communities. And and even within those communities, as you're sort of saying, I mean. When I was saying that, I kept finding white ghosts, it's not as though Black Americans don't have a long and rich history of folk tales and folklore about ghosts and spirits and haints and that sort of thing.
Right.
But that they'll happen kind of parallel to the white community's ghost stories, and that these two sort of different folklore traditions will happen alongside each other because they're doing different work for different communities, even in the same geographic location.
So how do you end up, because what you're saying here, the natural continuation for me goes to the large-scale hauntings and the idea that the lore of ghosts expands past the confines of a house and into a city.
Right.
What does that say about that community or about that culture? Is it like just every ghost story says something different?
Well, I mean, I looked at a couple like citywide hauntings, and in some cases you find that that's very much bound up in tourism. I think New Orleans, for example, sort of a classic example of a city that has really built its identity around, to be a little bit reductive here, New Orleans built its community around taking aspects of sort of organic Black culture and then repackaging it for white people in the French Quarter, right? And so that's jazz, that is the whole second line tradition, and that is also its ghost tradition. So it has this very vibrant tradition of folklore that now is sort of fed through the walking tours in downtown in the French Quarter in New Orleans. So in some cases it's very much about how a city will construct its tourist identity.
Right.
And I think the flip side of that is a place like Detroit, which I also spent a lot of time in, and which is another place
Speaking of haints.
Yeah, right, exactly. And is not marketing itself as a haunted place so much as dealing with the way the rest of the country has decided to write a narrative about Detroit that Detroit itself doesn't actually want or hasn't produced. And so the whole history of sort of ruin porn and the sort of fetishization of Detroit as this broken down, apocalyptic, haunted place, while Detroit's actual citizens are trying to craft an entirely different narrative. So so I think of those two different ways about how a city both creates its identity and has its identity created for it, through the way those ghost stories get told. Because ghost stories are ultimately always about history, right? So a place like Detroit, a place like New Orleans, these are places with long historical records that then get fed through ghost stories in really fascinating ways. So.
Like this. It makes me want to read more ghost stories and like dig a little deeper just to hear that. Ghostland and American history and haunted places. Are you working on anything else in the ghost space?
Right now, the book I'm working on is slightly different. It's more about UFOs and cryptozoology, which is like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, with a little bit of hopefully some flat Earth conspiracy theories thrown in. So it will be again about what you might call sort of fringe beliefs and sort of why we're fascinated with certain things that we don't necessarily believe to be true.
Well, come back and talk about that one too, because that sounds like a lot of fun. Thank you so much for being here today, Colin.
Thank you for having me on. This is super fun.
Thanks. How would New York survive without its subway system? Well, we're about to get a pretty good idea when the L train shuts down next year. And we'd certainly have far fewer butts for our jokes and a lot less inspiration for our art. Inspiration is what drew half a dozen contestants out to Littlefield in Brooklyn last month for the Miss Subways pageant. The first such pageant happened in 1941 with an advertising agency as its sponsor and ran for 36 years after that. Brooklyn City Reliquary Museum revived the pageant 2 years ago, opening the field to contestants of all gender identities and shifting the pageant's focus towards activism. This year's winner was Brooklynite Parker MacLure, who's here to tell us about how they plan to use this platform in the coming year. Thanks for coming on 112BK, Parker.
Thank you for having me.
It's such our pleasure to have you. We have Miss Subways up in here, so this is a real win for us. What inspired you to compete for the crown of Miss Subways? Are you a commuter?
I am a commuter. I take the G and the A train every day. I have always been fascinated by the subway and public transportation in general because I just find it as a great equalizer in a lot of ways, and I also love when people in such a big city as New York are forced to be in such close quarters. And I follow the issues of, the subway funding and the issues of accessibility and all these things, and I have a lot to say about how I think they could improve. And I actually had been reading about the pageant from the 40s through the 70s and had kind of already decided that I was a Miss Subways, and then I learned about the competition. My friend sent it to me the day before the deadline to apply, and I just immediately was like, I have to do this. And I stayed up all night writing my application. And so, that's what inspired me to join.
I love the idea that you knew you were Miss Subways way before you got the sash and the crown.
Oh, yes.
I love that.
Fully.
Speaking of the crown, which I thought might be made of some old subway track, but it turns out it isn't. We have it here in the studio.
Yes.
Now, you already are wearing this amazing peach jumpsuit that apparently is from some corner of Berlin.
Yes.
And you have on, your earrings are MTA cards.
Yes, made them myself.
Made them yourself. I love these Metro cards. Those are wonderful. Your black nail polish is giving me everything. The black Miss Subway sash. You're already killing it. And then there's this crown. This crown sitting here on the desk made of so many beautiful things. I mean, there's a golden rat. There is a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle skateboard. Please describe, talk to me about this crown.
So the crown was made by Rev Jen, who's an artist in Brooklyn, and she was one of the judges for the competition. She made last year's crown as well. And I wasn't sure if I was going to get, the crown gets passed on or if there's a new crown each year.
Right.
But then last year's winner, Lisa Levy, she came out with the new crown and crowned me once it was announced that I would win. It's very large, but it's fun. It definitely I wore it all night. I got a lot of questions, got to tell people, I was the reigning Miss Subway starting that day. But I love it for every time I look at it, I've had it for over a month now, but I always find something new on it that I didn't realize was there.
I love that. I found several new things just sitting here while we've been talking. So tell me a little bit about the Miss Subways program. What's it like? What happens?
Okay, so the modern program?
The modern program.
The modern program. It's run by the City Reliquary, like you said, which is a small New York City history museum in Williamsburg on Metropolitan, just east of Havmeyer. And so it's a fundraiser for them and the Riders Alliance, which is a transit advocacy nonprofit. And they were just working and successfully helped get fair fares in New York City. So it hasn't started yet, but it'll be affordable Metro cards for low-income New Yorkers, which has been something they've been pushing for a really long time. And then they also are pushing for, better service and those types of things. They work a lot with City Hall. But so then the programming it was a talent. So we had to apply with an essay. I wrote an essay and I made a small video about how I was Miss Subways. And then, but all the people who qualified then had to do a talent, but it could be anything. So I did a lip sync of, it was three songs. There was a Charlie XCX song called Vroom Vroom about riding. Like the lyrics are like "Let's ride, let's ride," and I, pantomimed being on the subway and was lip syncing all the lyrics because I had just barely made the G train. And then the train broke down, and then I used a very harsh RuPaul critique that was saying, make it work, just make it happen. I don't want to hear any more excuses. And then I did a RuPaul song that the lyrics are you make it work.
Right.
And then I went into Cynthia Nixon's subway ad and was criticizing, Governor Cuomo and his neglect for the MTA and what we're forced to deal with as New Yorkers. And I drank a bottle of what I labeled as his tears.
Yes, okay. I heard about this specifically.
Yeah.
And what I want to know about that is, how do you harvest those?
Well, you have to have people on the inside. I can't disclose my sources for obtaining his tears, but I will tell you that they're very bitter.
Yeah, very bitter.
Yes.
Yes, this I've heard.
Yeah.
So you had a good time.
Yes, I had a great time.
It sounds like the program is really fun and it does good.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to me a little bit about the expectations of the crown.
Right.
You are now a representative.
Yes.
What does that mean? How are you going to use that platform?
So just like the talent competition where it's very open-ended and you can do it whatever you would like.
Right.
It's kind of, you get to use the power in the way that you choose. They ask that you are a transit advocate and use your own creative lens. So I've had a lot of ideas about how I want to use the crown. I think I want to continue with my drag persona of Miss Subways. I want to help raise awareness around issues that I find particularly pressing about the subway. And I'm hoping to make some videos of me on the subway where I'm doing trivia with random strap hangers, and it'll range from fun historical facts to how many stations don't have elevators,
Which is way too many.
Yes, way too many.
Yes.
I think as of last year, it was 80% of New York City subway stations were not wheelchair accessible.
Oh yeah.
Which is really, really bad because, people who are differently abled, that's one of the only ways that they can have independence is by using public transportation. And the bus system has been neglected as well, which is one of the only ways for people to get around if they aren't able-bodied. And then the city's been, the ADA was passed ages ago, and we haven't even made a real good faith effort to make all of the stations accessible.
I agree with that. I moved here to New York on crutches and found out very, very quickly how many stations weren't accessible.
Yeah.
So, luckily my eyes were opened to that early, so I could be supportive of legislation that would help something like that. That's a current issue. That's something that is probably, near the top of your agenda as you are the representative for Miss Subways. But do you have any special plans for the apocalypse?
I live near the L train. I live in Greenpoint. I rely on the G, but I use the L a lot on weekends. I feel like I'm getting a small taste of the L shutdown right now because it's shut down every weekend, which is when I use it most frequently. I'm looking forward to riding the new ferry that goes from Williamsburg to 14th Street, but as of right now, I think I'm just going to pray that adding cars to the G train is enough.
Yeah.
that they run enough JMZ trains over the Williamsburg Bridge. I'll definitely be, I'll stop riding with my headphones and I'll keep my ears open for any distressed riders so that I can comfort them and let them know that it will end eventually. The L train will come back. Not as quickly as we hope, but unfortunately it has to happen. And I just am going to pressure the city to, use my new power to pressure the city to do what is really necessary to deal with the displaced riders, because it's a lot.
Yeah, if this was an elected position, I would have voted for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, Parker.
Yes, of course.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And now some news. Election Day is almost here, and already swing left volunteers have reached out to millions of voters by knocking on doors and making calls to swing districts across the country. But the biggest weekend of action is coming up. And to kick it off, Swing Left has organized a free event for volunteers at Cooper Union on Thursday at 8 p.m. It will be a night of music, comedy, and activism with founder and executive director of Equality for Her, Blair Imani, New York City Council Speaker Corey Johnson, and outspoken celebrities like Mark Ruffalo, Maggie Gyllenhaal, Cecily Strong, and Sarah Bareilles, not to mention the Resistance Revival Chorus, and more. RSVP to the event and volunteer at swingleft.org/rallies. The city of New York announced they will provide language interpreters at 86 polling sites throughout Brooklyn. However, voters whose native language is Russian, Haitian Creole, Italian, Arabic, Polish, and Yiddish will have to seek interpreter services a full 101 feet away from the polling sites, per the Board of Election specifications. Interpreters can accompany voters inside the polling site upon request, but can only be accessed at this 101-foot distance. Brooklyn Assemblyman Steve Simbrowitz has called this plan an effort to disenfranchise voters who genuinely need language assistance. The hurdle is one among many national examples of voter suppression, from purged voter rolls in Ohio to exact match ID in Georgia. 6 years after Hurricane Sandy killed 43 New Yorkers and caused $19 billion worth of damage to the city, the MTA has finally announced the date of the impending shutdown of the L train. Drum roll, please. April 27th. Mark your calendars, pump up your bike tires, ready those walking shoes, and plan those carpools. Or just find a job in Brooklyn. Recently, the state comptroller, Thomas DiNapoli, announced that the borough is growing jobs at a rate faster than the rest of the city, state, and country. Which is why they say, if you can't make it here, you can't make it anywhere. That's the show for today. Tomorrow, Mackenzie Fagan will be back for a chat about the podcast Everything is Alive. Hope you can join us.